We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about roadkill. We're not talking about numbers. These are human beings who've been killed in horrendous circumstances, and they need to be recognized. They need to be acknowledged as such.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
As a journalist, part of my job is to present facts and figures. And when I'm reporting on conflicts, there are often the numbers of the dead, the wounded, and it can be quite a task sifting through the numbers, the estimates. And of course, we always wonder, have we gotten this right?
Oh, Steph, I really rely on you. You're my Stephopedia. At the drop of a hat, you can reel off the statistics of what we know about an incident that might have happened decades ago. But also in our job, conscious that these facts and figures, insofar as we know them, they also form some of the basis of the arguments that we hear in courts.
Yeah, but where do these numbers come from? I tend to look at UN reports, but even there we don't know where they come from. So who is collecting the data? How accurate is it? And how does it get used?
So to help us understand some of the fundamentals and explore with us the meaning of recording the numbers and the names of those who've suffered in wars are two women. First off is Emily Tripp, who heads Air Wars, which describes itself as a transparency watchdog which tracks, assesses, archives and investigates civilian harm claims in conflict-affected nations. Hi, Emily.
Hi both of you.
And we have Rachel Taylor from Every Casualty Counts, which we're going to call ECC. And ECC says its mission is to, quote, ensure that every life lost to armed violence is identified correctly, recorded effectively, and recognized appropriately, end quote. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we've said what your organizations say they do, but maybe each of you can say a bit more in detail. What is it exactly that you do? And we'll start with you, Rachel.
So at Every Casualty Counts, we work with organizations around the world who document people who've been killed in armed conflict and armed violence. We have about 57 members of the Casualty Recorders Network at the moment, and they cover all sorts of contexts, both current conflicts, historic conflicts which have ended, some of them many decades ago. Some of them work very locally in the areas where the conflict is taking place. They are literally surrounded by the bombing themselves. And some of them are operating remotely. So they might be doing online monitoring of casualties. And we also work in a political level at the United Nations with diplomats, governments, to push them to do better in relation to documenting the dead from armed conflict.
And Emily, what does Air Wars do specifically?
As Janet said very well, we document civilian harm. We also conduct investigations into particular incidents of harm to try and expose those responsible. And we really work at scale for our documentation practices. So we've been working in the Middle East for a long time, in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. We've also done some work in Ukraine. But our kind of main aim is to make sure that documentation in the public record is sound, and then confront states responsible for harm with the civilian toll of their own actions. So we do this to kind of try and seek accountability, but also make sure that those practices are better, that we can mitigate harm, and that we can make sure that when harm does occur, states are able to respond to those claims and routes for accountability are established, whether that's reparations, amends, redress, or any kind of form of justice and accountability that we really feel should be driven by the civilians themselves.
Just raises so many questions, but just before we go further, I know that Rachel has already mentioned the Casualty Recorders Network. I know that Air Wars is also part of that. But I wanted to bring in the voice of Khalif Hassan from Somalia, who is one of the members of this network. I was listening to him describe the reality of being a casualty recorder on the ground. It was part of a webinar for African human rights defenders to introduce them to some of the concepts. And his organization called Amaria, which started in 1991, was essentially founded because of the civil war. They based themselves on humanitarian principles, and because there's this complete lack of institutions in a place that's going through civil war, they were looking into how to protect civilians, especially women, and children. But he also started to explain what they actually do now.
We do investigation, documentation, and monitoring of human rights violation. So the way we recording that, we starting using 5W, for example, what happened, who was the victim, where it was happening, when it was happening, who was behind, and all details. So we record and collect all data, and sometimes we assist those who are suffering, for example, that victims.
Khalid also explained that they are looking at different types of casualties, some deliberate ones, which can be attacks by militants like Al-Shabaab, sometimes deliberate ones to do with the conflict over resources, local conflicts, and some that he called kind of unintentional, but these are the results of things like drone attacks.
The type of casualties normally happen in Somalia. There is a two type of casualties. I can say there is a casualties caused by intentionally. For example, the casualties caused by militant group like Al-Shabaab. Other conflict between tribes. The central government has collapsed. All kind of women has fall on the hand of the civilian. Also, there is another cause of victim. For example, Somalia was operating a mission of Africa. It's called ADMIS, African Union Transition Mission of Somalia. They operate in, for example, Mogadishu and different regions. Sometimes they open fire as they thinking they are getting risky. They feel they say some threats. For example, they have seen sometimes a traffic jam. So whenever they feel any threat, they open fire in order to defend themselves. That fire has caused the casualties of the innocent people. So another cause of casualties, I can say unintentionally cause of casualties like drone attack used by foreign forces. For example, foreign forces are assisting government of Somalia. They share information. Maybe the government is sharing information that specific area was hiding the militant Al-Shabaab. That drone, sometimes they cause casualties of innocent people.
And then he also outlined some of the challenges that his organisation faces. And we're talking about really remote areas they have to go to. And they're under threat from the government at times who doesn't like what they do. And then they have the pressure from the people that they're counting the problems of, counting the deaths and the casualties and so on, the victims who want some help and some redress.
So the negative challenges we are facing, for example, we are collecting our information, different area. We traveling area to area. We face as a Omario community some challenges. For example, in terms of security, in terms of threats coming from the government side, because sometimes government side has made violation of the human rights and don't want to or collect that information. Because the government sees that information was affecting their job. Some of our members have lost and others has injured when we are collecting that information. So I can say some people need, for example, some medical assistance. So when you collecting that information, sometimes it's difficult to deal those who are suffering a lot in terms of injury, in terms of physical damage.
So, Rachel, we just heard from Khalif what it's actually like working on the ground. You say there are a number of organisations in the network. So I'm wondering what binds them. I mean, there must be some kind of basic principles that everybody has to use, or a way of working.
Yeah, that's right. I think, first of all, on a motivational level, what joins all of these organisations together is this fundamental sense that we are talking about human beings. We're not talking about roadkill. We're not talking about numbers. These are human beings who've been killed in horrendous circumstances, and they need to be recognized. They need to be acknowledged as such. So that motivation, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza or Guatemala or Tigray or wherever it is, that is the same reason why everybody is doing this work. And then the method of doing it obviously does vary very much depending on who's doing it and for what purposes, for example. So as we heard for Khalif, it is often in a very remote area. There may be a lack of access to reliable electricity and software to document and record the information that they gathered, which could be very different from some of the organizations who do very, very high-tech, online, open source, big data trolling, satellite imagery. But the principles are still very much the same in the sense of anyone doing this work accurately and effectively needs to be doing it transparently. You need to be opened to the extent that a security situation allows. You need to be open about what information you're collecting, where you're collecting it from, how you're categorizing it, to do so consistently, and to be transparent above all about what are the limitations of the information that you've gathered, what are the limitations of the sources. So we often say you don't have to be objective to be a good casualty recorder. You can be very subjective as long as you're open about that. So it's fine to only be recording, for example, deaths in one area or deaths from one party to the conflict, as long as you are acknowledging that and you're transparent that that's what you're doing. In fact, in some ways, it's suspicious when people claim to be doing everything openly and covering every part, because nobody has that kind of access and nobody is completely objective. So transparency is key, and consistency.
And do you have is there a form that people can take when they record deaths, the stuff that they have to record about casualties? Is there a gold standard for this?
In 2016, Every Casualty Counts published the standards for casualty recording, which we developed in association with members of the Casualty Recorders Network. And so they outline in great detail the principles around transparency and methodology and documentation. But they also recognize the fact that people will be working in very different circumstances with very different resources and quite possibly for different outcomes. So if you're documenting, for example, to provide evidence to a war crimes tribunal, you will need to be recording different types of information potentially and at a level of verification, which is different to if you are, for example, simply reporting to the media on deaths. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all, this is what everyone should record and this is how you should record it. But there are principles which do apply to everybody. And as long as everyone is applying those principles and those standards and being transparent about it, then it's much easier for that kind of information to be shared across organizations, across contexts. So you can see, for example, is violence getting worse? Is there a particular area that's being more affected? And when you have arguments about the deaths, which is routine everywhere, you can see, if you are using the same standards to verify and document casualties and you're transparent about that, then people can make their own informed judgment about how reliable they think your information is. If you can't say how you've documented it and how you've verified it, then frankly, nobody should put much faith in your figures. If you can be clear about how you've done it and you've done it to a good, consistent standard, then that's plausible.
Emily, Khalif, in the bits that I picked out from him, he also mentioned drones and foreign forces operating in Somalia. And we know that they're working in lots of different places. And that's also what I kind of associate air wars with. And we did a podcast with Jessica Dorsey about drones. I know that she's on your board. And I'm wondering whether Air Wars has really developed and focused in on this because of the war on terror. And are you just saying this is what's really important to these remote places that nobody else is reporting on? Is that what you're about?
I mean, we really came out of this feeling, and as Rachel said, actually, that casualties, when they occur, they should be accounted for. And the war on terror happened to be one of the more impenetrable conflict zones where it was very unclear, particularly because it's a predominantly remote warfare, like remote form of war, where the states that are doing the actions are doing it in places where it's quite hard to find out what kind of happens on the other end of those strikes, drone strikes, for example. So we were trying to kind of fit into that space to say, okay, the dominant narrative of the military is the one that is taking the most space in this conversation in the war on terror. And actually, there's something that's happening in Yemen, in Pakistan, in other areas that we're not seeing back home. I'm a British citizen. It's my taxes that go into funding that war, but I don't really know what's happening. And the only thing I do know is the narrative that's being given to me by my government. And I think in any kind of democracy, the kind of legitimacy of the armed forces comes in really understanding what they're doing rather than a kind of blind faith approach. So our casualty recording came from this, I would say, transparency black hole that was associated with the war on terror and originally associated with drone strikes. But since then, we've moved on. In the last 10 years or so, we've really documented very intense urban areas. So we documented all civilian casualties in the war against ISIS, in the battles of Mosul and Raqqa. We've looked at Russian campaign in Syria, in Aleppo. We've looked at parts of Ukraine, as I said before. I mean, we were really kind of trying to capture that civilian toll, but in a way that moved beyond the statistics that were thrown around by different organizations. And as Rachel said, one of the great things about the standards of the for casualty recording is this transparency approach. So we see ourselves as kind of part of this ecosystem where we document the casualties and we document it in a transparent way. And then we become a kind of bouncing off point for others to go and then do investigations because we believe that our work should be kind of recreatable.
And have you seen that this recording that you do in the Netherlands, we've seen with the Hawija attack, which was also partly covered, I think, by your organization, or at least Jessica covers that quite extensively, that there is some underreporting of civilian casualties, and has the fact that you are there trying to give an objective number, have you seen that that has led to changes in the way the military conducts these operations and the pressure on the military to improve?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our guiding principles. And I'm glad you brought up the Netherlands. We've been doing a lot of work in the Netherlands the last few years. As you said, Hawija happened. It was an airstrike on an industrial center in Iraq, and more than 80 civilians were killed. And we documented it at the time. We then worked with journalists, and then journalists and other organizations like PAX did their own independent research, really brilliant work trying to document that civilian toll. And it prompted this kind of, oh God, moment within the Netherlands, I think. And the Ministry of Defense, they've now set up their own protection of civilians team. They now have systems within this thing in the Netherlands called the Article 100 letter, which is essentially the kind of letter that the Ministry of Defense will put to Parliament to say, we're about to go to war. So now there have to be sentences within those letters. They just produced one actually about the operation in Yemen. They have to include sentences around what they're going to do for civilian harm. We've been working with them again on kind of what does it look like for a military to collect data on civilian casualties. I mean, this is one of my big things that takes up a lot of my time, is trying to look at this from a perspective of the military to say, okay, well, you've got these battle damage assessments, you've got these mechanisms within your own military practices that, in theory are meant to help you account for civilian harm. And yet something's happening that means that it's not really working. And the thing that's happening is that, for example, in the UK, the British government has only ever admitted to killing one civilian in the whole war against ISIS. And we know from the practice of the military that they were the second biggest power, essentially, in battles like Raqqa, that there's this huge discrepancy between what's happening on the ground and what they're doing. So a lot of what I do is try and say, let's try and figure this out, almost together, as it were. And the Netherlands, I think, is one of the it's a leading example of a state that's been willing to figure out how to do that better.
Rachel, did you want to join in?
So, as Emily was saying, the British government claims to have killed one civilian in the whole of the war on ISIS. And this is a really interesting point, and it's very pertinent to what we're seeing at the moment in Gaza, because, for example, the Israeli authorities are saying they've killed X many thousand Hamas militants and X many civilians, whereas the Ministry of Health information that's coming out is giving a total of people killed, which is not dividing that up into combatants versus civilians, but it does give a demographic breakdown of adults, males, females, children. And this is a really interesting point, because the question of whether someone is a combatant or a militant or participating in fighting is not necessarily a straightforward factual question. It's a very complicated legal point. So what can happen is that you can see military forces saying, we've killed no civilians, everyone we've killed was a combatant. Well, unless you're documenting every single person and their identity and who they were and what they were doing at the time that they were killed, you don't know whether that was a civilian or a combatant, or possibly a combatant who was hors de combat and therefore not a legal target. And so, for example, in Gaza at the moment, what would appear to be the case is that the Israeli Defense Forces are essentially have a very wide definition of who they believe to be a combatant, which is why they can say we've killed this many Hamas militants, whereas other people are saying, no, those were civilians. And I think it's really important, the fact that the figures coming from the Ministry of Health are not dividing people into combatants and civilians, because that's not the role of a doctor to make that kind of assessment. The role of a doctor is to identify the demography of the deceased, whether it was a man, a woman, a child, whether they have what their status of health is, in this case, clearly dead, and what the cause of death was. So when people are saying, the Ministry of Health should be saying, they're claiming it's all women, they're claiming it's all children, they're not referring to the combatants. Of course they're not. They shouldn't be. And that's a sign that data is more reliable. I'd be very suspicious if they were saying something about who they consider to be a combatant and who is not.
When you're talking about there, the distinction between militants and non-militants in casualties, some of the criticism levied at Reuters for using the figures from the Hamas-led health ministry is in fact that they don't make that distinction. But somebody pointed out to me that in the general figure that we use for Israeli casualties on October 7th, we also do not make that distinction. And the 1,200 that we generally say as the number of victims also includes some military personnel. And even though Israel did give those figures at some point in the general discourse, we don't use them. We just use the general 1,200 figure.
For ECC, one of the points that we have about recording every casualty and not only civilians is precisely because it's so hard to make that distinction at first call. You have to be documenting everybody in order then to establish who was a civilian and who wasn't. If you only try to document civilians or only military, it's much harder then to make sure you've captured all of the right people. But then I think there's also a question of, so that's why we believe it's really important to record every casualty and not try and start breaking it down into military or not military or this or that. It's everyone is still a human being.
Yeah, you can see we really have that war crime slant of is it a combatant, is it not? But of course, you're right. Every person counts.
That humanitarian principle stuff, Rachel, sort of worried me a bit when I was listening to what Khalif had to say, that he was also talking about providing medical assistance and how important that was with the work that he's doing in Somalia. You start to wonder, well, would that actually skew the figures then, that people say, I've got X number of relatives who've died because then maybe I get some kind of compensation?
Yeah, you can always say there are, lies, damned lies and statistics. And that's why when you document individuals, you get away from this argument over big numbers, which can be very difficult to identify what's true and what's not. When somebody comes to you with a death certificate of a specific individual at a specific time, then it's much clearer what the reality is.
But you're talking in Somalia, as he said, a failed state, essentially. I mean, you don't have institutions that give out a death certificate.
Yeah, and it's precisely where you have these badly functioning civil registration systems that casualty recording is so important, because there is no official record of who's died or what their status was. And so it comes down to civil society documenting that and knowing who is who has become bereaved, who is a war widow. There was one of the casualty recorders from Somalia I was speaking with who was talking about when there was a big bomb explosion in the center of Mogadishu. They were going out there and they knew which children had become orphans, and they were tracking them down and making sure that they had food because they knew nobody else was looking after them. And they only knew that because they documented everybody who had died.
And Emily, the other thing that struck me from what he said was talking about getting legal assistance for people. He actually said sort of hiring lawyers. I'm not sure exactly how that would work. I mean, is that part of what you're trying to do, is actually end up essentially in court as a way of providing redress for people?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of more goes back to what I was saying, that we see ourselves as part of this ecosystem of accountability. We work very closely with a program called the Redress Program in the US. So it's headed up by this completely formidable human rights lawyer, Joanna Naples-Mitchell, at the Zomia Center. And she has really been kind of diligently advocating for civilians who've been killed or had relatives killed by the US. And she tries to unlock, essentially, there's a kind of compensation fund within the US. It's $3 million, which is ostensibly set aside to pay victims of their own actions. And so we work with her where we can to say, look, we've documented all these civilians who've been, we think, likely killed by the US. And then she is this incredible tag team where she then takes those cases, but fights her own fight. And that is a brilliant thing that she does. There's also these kind of justice mechanisms. I mean, we were just talking about the Netherlands. another brilliant human rights lawyer, Lisbeth Zegveld, who has just brought a landmark ruling, really, in the Netherlands, where a civil court essentially said, look, the Dutch government need to pay out for civilians who were killed in 2007 in Afghanistan as part of a NATO strike. I mean, this is 15 years of battles and fighting and trying to get this compensation unlocked. And each state will have their own mechanism. I think this is the real tragedy in some ways of these coalitions, is that it's this collective responsibility, which essentially means collective impunity, because in order to get compensation from a state, you need to know exactly which state was the one that dropped a bomb. Whereas in the coalitions, they all say that they dropped the bombs together. So one of our jobs is to try and piece apart that accountability and that attribution and say, okay, well, we actually think it was the Dutch strike that did that one, or we think it's the British that did that one. And then we feed that into, in some senses, these incredible lawyers like Lisbeth and like Joanna, but in other times, NGOs like Civic. They're an NGO based in The Hague and the US, and they also do this fighting for more policy change. So like advocating for the policies and practices and systems around compensation and redress to be changed, particularly in the US, but also in other bodies like NATO. We see ourselves as the documenters, but then also where we can, we feed those into very specific processes to make sure that, you know, we're not just collecting this stuff and it's sitting online for our own purpose, but it actually goes into a kind of wider and broader accountability.
We have done also a podcast with Lisbeth Zegveld that we will link to in the show notes so that listeners can see, because that is not the only human rights trial that Lisbeth does in the Netherlands. If we look at some of the current conflicts, and there's a lot to pick off, and we've already mentioned briefly Gaza, but let's start now with Sudan. Who knows how many are dead and injured and who's responsible? Do we have accurate figures of what is going on the ground in Sudan? And if not, what are really the issues surrounding the documentation over there?
So in Sudan, we've recently started working with an organization called the Sudanese American Physicians Association, and they have been documenting casualties in Sudan. Obviously, because they're physicians, they're located within hospitals anyway, which is where a lot of documentation of the dead will typically happen. And at the beginning of the conflict, they were certainly keeping quite a regularly updated list of victims. Obviously, as that goes on and as more and more hospitals are destroyed and it becomes harder for people to access them, the reliability of the figures can go down because it's simply not coming through the system. And in most cases, it's sometime after a conflict's come to an end that you will ever really know the truth about the scale of the number of people who've died, because you can document things in the moment in the way that Air Wars does, in the way that other organizations do. And that is a starting point. But when you have a really intense conflict, or if you're in a very remote area or an area where the security is very, very poor and it's impossible for people to access safely, you can't document everything now. You have to take what you can, and then that gives you the starting point for a future investigation. So I would say right now, I don't think anyone has completely reliable figures for Sudan, and anyone who claims they do is probably not telling you the whole truth.
Emily, in that webinar that I was listening to, you used a phrase, ranges of ambiguity. Just before we started recording this, I was listening to a podcast about what's been going on in Ethiopia, Tigray. And my God, there was a range of ambiguity there about how many people might have died. And there was a very strong line to say, we actually care less about places which are further away from us and where essentially it's brown people who are being killed. The amount we know is basically dependent on how close people are to us in feel and ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we try and do is pick up on all of the things that are said already by local voices on the ground. If you look in Gaza, one of the main sources for us are relatives who are posting about, people who are posting about their relatives who've been killed, and they're just putting their whole family names and they're putting everything. And only in a few times do you see those posts picked up by the international media. I think, it's due to a whole number of things, and usually institutional racism is at the bottom of it. But you see a kind of general distrust of local reporting. The real tragedy is that it's not that these things aren't being said. I think we can say for sure in certain remote locations it's really challenging to get information, but in other locations it's really not that challenging. Talk about Gaza, talk about Syria. These are cases where, and we can kind of see a direct correlation. It's an awful kind of tragic thing, but we can see a direct correlation between the more conflict is ignored, the more graphic the imagery becomes, because the civilians on the ground just think, what, you just haven't seen the right picture. Surely you just haven't seen this picture of this child. You don't know this thing. Because if you did, you would do something about it. And that's all of our shame that we're not doing anything about it. I'm talking to you from a nice office in London, and I'm not feeling that weight constantly of my safety and bombardment. And I think that's why it's like, as an organization, we have a duty to use our access and our leverage and the trust that is kind of bestowed upon me because of the way that I speak or the color of my skin, in order to make sure that we document all of those voices and that we kind of record them for the public record. So I'm hoping that the world will one day be such that you can look back on those things and say, okay, well, at least somebody documented it at the time of those, before the Twitter accounts or before Elon Musk decided to delete the whole of the Twitter archive, that somebody kind of recorded them and kept them for the time being, because the reasons why we don't listen to things are many, but you kind of hope for a better future where at least you could look back and see that the public record kind of exists.
Did you want to say something, Rachel?
I would like to 100% back what Emily just said. I think she's hit the nail on the head. There's this attitude that, it's too difficult to know what's happening in those war zones. It's too far away. It's too complicated. It is far away and it may be complicated, but the people there know what's happening. When you talk about an unknown civilian, that civilian was not unknown to their family. That civilian was known and loved and wanted and is deeply missed. Those people are definitely known, and there's no reason not to recognize that. It's very politically helpful not to recognize that these individual people who have voices and who have grieving family members and who have horrible wounds. But that's a choice. That's a choice by the media and by politicians not to recognize individual human beings and instead to blur it with statistics or with estimates, where what you're talking about is a number rather than a person. When you start treating people as numbers instead of human beings, it always draws me straight back to the idea of the Holocaust, where people had their names replaced with numbers on their arms. And that is dehumanization, and that enables you to kill masses and masses and millions of people. But if you see each of those as an individual, you have a very different approach to conflict and to the sanitization of conflict.
We also have to look at ourselves, or at least me as myself as a journalist, for the role of the media in long-running wars such as Yemen, for example. We hear a lot about how difficult it is to get information, but media does occasionally do reports on it. Does the pressure from media make a difference? New York Times will do a big report and then all of a sudden Yemen will be in the interest a bit. How are we doing as media covering these things, do you think?
Well, one of the, I would say, target audiences for our work is the media. And we've been asked a lot of questions since Gaza, and we've worked with the New York Times before, the brilliant journalist Azmat Khan, who was the one who did a lot of the investigations into civilian harm in the war against ISIS. I think one of the things is that the states will only be pushed into action as soon as the media that they trust is speaking the right language will do something. The US have now committed to this civilian harm mitigation and response action plan, which is a new thing that's happening in America. And the impetus for that, they directly credit the New York Times. They want a Pulitzer and they say, well, the New York Times covered this thing. And so, while yes, that's so true and that journalism is so important, what we need to make sure is that those journalists are also equipped with the knowledge and the systems and the mechanisms to amplify the local journalists. This has been one of the great tragedies and difficulties of Gaza, is that there has just been almost complete annihilation of those local journalists. We documented Gaza in May 2021. You'd see journalists just kind of flocking to the scene, and they would all be taking pictures and they'd all be writing stories and interviewing witnesses and posting them online and getting testimonies off Al Jazeera and AFP and others. And now you're really not seeing that level of documentation. So the first people on the ground, the first responders, in some ways, particularly in these conflict zones, are journalists who've had to become kind of war journalists overnight. We saw that in Ukraine as well. And for sure, I think the media is, in the West at least, the big thing that can be done is to give those freelancers and give those stringers credit for that documentation that would be completely impossible without them.
Thinking about Ukraine, we know there's been a really tight control there over figures, particularly figures of the numbers who have died in the military, but also some of the civilian casualties. I kind of understand why, because they want to not upset people or maybe make people sort of worry about what's going on in the war. But I just wonder how you deal with the issues there, whether you feel that somehow your principles are more important than somebody else's war.
So I'm not a politician and I've never had to direct a war. And so I have no ability to comment on the strategic wisdom or otherwise of concealing figures on the dead, whether they're military or they're civilian. I think every family has the right to know what has happened to their loved ones. And I think I'm right, Emily will correct me, but I believe on the Air Wars website, for example, they publish information about people who've been killed, but with a very clear proviso that if any family members want this removed, they will immediately remove it. And likewise, if the family member wants a different photograph of their loved one to be used, they will use it. And so it's about recognizing and respecting the rights of those families, which is not just a nice idea for people in safe offices in the UK. It is a right under international law to know what has happened to your loved one in armed conflict. And again, when you're documenting people as individuals rather than statistics, that's a very different issue when it comes to strategic military propaganda, where you're trying to give an overall sense of the power of your armed force versus another one. So it's not something that I think is in any way something which can undermine a military approach to a particular situation, documenting the dead. I think it's essential. And in some cases where we've seen, for example, that casualty recorders are operating in environments where it's not very secure for them or for the witnesses that they've gathered information from, you can still document all of that information. You may not publish it immediately, but if you don't document it from the beginning, it will be lost. And then you are faced with a situation where decades and decades later, families and descendants of the people who were killed are still trying to find out what happened to their loved ones. And that is recognized as a form of torture internationally. That is a form of torture. So there's no excuse for that.
Emily, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would just add from our perspective, and we documented civilian casualties in the Battle of Kharkiv, which is a very complicated early battleground after the escalation. And I think it was really interesting understanding the media environment there. I mean, as an organization, we always hire teams local to the context that we're monitoring because they know the environment better than anybody else. And we found that actually there were very few reports online. For example, in the way that we see in Gaza, you get a whole list of victims and people put that online. And it seemed that actually there was a kind of fear, particularly in those areas of Ukraine, that they didn't want to be putting stuff online, that they actually trusted and were deferential to the decisions made by the state in some senses. And they were deferential to the local emergency response systems and to the record keeping systems that happen within Ukraine, that there wasn't this kind of taking casualty recording into their own hands approach that we see in areas where the state really doesn't exist in that way. So I think it's, on the one hand, yes, it's a kind of strategic decision that was made by the Ukrainian government, but also I think it came from a very genuine fear of Ukrainians to say, look, I don't actually think it's necessarily safe for us to be putting all this information online when the Russians could invade at any minute. So I think we have to acknowledge the local appetite. And as Rachel was saying, I mean, one of the things we do is if there's something that we've done wrong, we're quite transparent. We say, please tell us. Or if you don't want this online, please tell us. But that's why organizations like Victims Memorial, who are now a member of the Casualty Recorders Network, are utterly brilliant because they are an organization, Ukrainian organization, and they go and interview family by family by family. And they speak to them. They have a whole thing on their website about kind of trauma-informed interviews. And it might be, yes, they're only publishing, for example, the 10% of the information they have, but they're doing it for the public record. And I think that's why it's important for us to recognize that we want to know the exactly how many people died at whatever given moment, but we really have to trust and listen to the local populations to say, is that safe to be talking about that right now? I would say always, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or wherever, being able to kind of be deferential to those voices on the ground and trying to figure out what it is that's safe for them at that moment should be the priority over and above anything else, really.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel and Emily, for informing us about this. I find it really interesting to get some insights into one of the basics of our world of understanding these beyond the statistics, let's say. We always round up the podcast with a number of questions. And the first one to both of you, is there anything that you wish that you'd had time to say that you haven't had a moment to say?
I think from ECC's perspective, one of the things which is very important but often completely overlooked is the fact that states have an obligation to ensure that victims of armed conflict are recorded. Not just victims of armed conflict, but of mass human rights violations which don't constitute armed conflict, which is a distinction that maybe your listeners will be very familiar with. Not everybody is. And that doesn't mean that they have to do the recording themselves. And indeed, in many, if not most, of the contexts of armed conflict at the moment, the state is an active party who would have an interest in suppressing information about who is being killed and how and by whom. What's important is to have that plurality of voices of people from all sides of the conflict, from all backgrounds, from all perspectives, recording the information that they can about the deceased, so that ultimately what you have when the time is right, which may be far into the future, but there will come a point where all of that can be brought together to give a complete, holistic description and identification of everybody who's been killed. And there are examples of this which are really they take my breath away every time I see them. There's the Kosovo Memory Book, which documents alphabetically, I think it's over 13,000 people who were killed in Kosovo. Bosnian Book of the Dead, which has several 100,000 victims in it, I believe, identified and given their own small obituary. There's an extraordinary film, which I really recommend to anybody who gets the chance to see it, called Lost Lives, which is based on a book of the same name, which documents every single person who was killed during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And it's incredibly, incredibly moving, and a beautiful film and very simple. And that is what can come of these initiatives. At a certain point, you can put together, you can reconstruct those societies in memorials. And I think that's a really, really important task that everybody should be involved in.
Anything you want to add, Emily?
Yeah, maybe I can just, as a final note, just understanding the context that we're speaking about this in is one particularly of casualty records being disbelieved in Gaza. And I just wanted to put a kind of mini plug for our work there and say we are one of the few organizations who are documenting where and how every civilian is being killed. And we've published now 300 cases. We have several thousand more to get to. But if your listeners are coming into this podcast going, how do I really understand these numbers? One of the ways is to really engage with the things that we've been producing, because, while we don't have this overall casualty statistic, and we won't for some time, it's going to take us a really long time to do this. As soon as you look at each of those records that we've been producing, you can kind of say, okay, look, it's complicated. And of course, there's misinformation out there, and there are things that are very difficult to believe, but also here are the cases where you can see civilians killed waiting for humanitarian aid, or civilians injured evacuating their homes, or where entire families have been wiped out on multiple generations, or all of the cases where civilians have been killed in their homes, or where children have been killed while they were playing. I mean, this is a scale of a conflict that we have not seen before in 10 years of casualty recording. And you can see that, and you can get a sense from that, even from these first cases. And I just kind of wanted to put a thing out there to say, as Air Wars, we are a starting point. So if anybody has any more information, or they need to use the archive, or they're trying to engage with it, please reach out to us and contact us, because you can via our website. And I really want to make sure all of these cases that we're documenting go into very concrete accountability and justice processes, whether that's now or in 5-10 years.
Well, that's a very sobering thought. And now I'm trying to segue into my other question, which is, we go a bit in the law nerd business of our podcast, because we are huge international law nerds, and we usually ask the people that we interview, is there a favorite court case that you have that you like to tell people about, or that really spurred you on in your work?
I'm definitely not a lawyer, and so I don't have a collection, but maybe just to explain a little bit about Lisbeth's case, because it's so complicated and unusual, but it's very important. We published a kind of visual explainer of the case so that people can get into it, because it's a civil case that's been brought in the Netherlands. But to my understanding, it's the first case that a civilian has essentially won a right to compensation from a state. It's not been appealed by the Ministry of Defence. In a civil court, where the court themselves essentially said that a member of NATO committed a violation of IHL, because they said that the Dutch aircraft and the Dutch commander didn't adequately distinguish between a military target and a civilian target. It seems complicated, but it also seems, I think the reason why this is so important is we see this all the time. This is a drop in the ocean of all of the cases that we at Air Wars have documented. I mean, we have thousands of these cases from the war against ISIS. And so this case, even though it's complicated and the ruling was all in Dutch, the importance of it is, well, you've got one, but you've got of thousands. At least from what I can see, there's nothing ostensibly about this case which is so unusual or different. It was pretty much any other case of a NATO airstrike, high intensity of the battle, and they essentially made a decision in that time, and that led to civilian deaths. Once you can get into it and understand it, it's worth having a read and understanding the importance of that precedence.
There's so many Lisbeth cases. Just to make sure, are you talking about the Afghanistan one with the koalas, or are you talking about the Hawija case? Because she's done both, actually.
She has. And the Hawija case is also, again, Lisbeth has used the civil system to bring about justice for victims. But yeah, I mean, the Afghanistan case is particularly interesting because it's 15 years old. So it was a strike that happened in 2007, and as Dutch is a member of NATO. And it got very little attention and traction. And Hawija, I mean, we're still waiting for the final ruling of that case. She's using the civil courts, and she's bringing about justice for victims in cases where civilians would never have thought that was possible. So I think that's just a brilliant example, I think.
Behind the scenes, I'm writing down all the different things we have to link to in the show notes on this one. And it's becoming a very, very long list because we've got podcasts that we've done previously on drones with Lisbeth directly on Hawija, plus all of the other things that you're mentioning. But we will make sure, if we can, to fit everything in if people are interested. And looking for some more links, let's start with you, Emily. What have you been reading or listening to or watching recently, which can be work-related or can be completely not work-related and can be to do with ballet, dancing, vampires or whatever? What would you like to suggest to our listenership?
I just actually read a fiction book for the first time in ages over the weekend, and I gobbled it in one day, which I never do. It normally takes me 5 years to get through about 300 pages, but it was a Barbara Comins book called Who Was Changed and Who Was Dead. It's also kind of on theme because it's a bit grim and about people dying, but it's very good. It's about a village. Everybody in the village starts dying of these kind of mysterious illnesses and going a little bit insane. I think it was originally published in 1950s and it's only just recently been published, but it's a story of quaint English life, but in a very kind of disturbing and awful way, but with a kind of semi-happy resolution.
Sounds great. Thank you. Rachel, yeah, what have you been reading, watching, listening to? Do you have any time for that?
I don't have a lot of time. I listen because my eyes are shot at the end of the day from too much staring at screens. It's nothing work related. I have been listening to a fantastic new podcast called Neuroshambles. It's by and for parents of children with neurodiversities. It's incredibly funny. I laugh out loud every time I listen to it. I would recommend it to anyone interested in that kind of thing. It's a spotlight into a certain life.
Well, as a mother to a neurodiverse kid, I'm definitely going to listen to that. Thanks for the recommendation.
Thank you both very, very much for giving us the time to do this. And yeah, really appreciate exploring some of the basics of our world.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice effort for mass violence. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.
Hi, it's us again.
Just to say that if you enjoyed the interview and you want to support our work, head on over to patreon.com and buy us a coffee there.
That way, you also get to hear the extra War Criminals Book Club podcast that we do every month.
And twice a year, we show you a little bit of what goes on behind the scenes. You can meet the team and ask what subjects you would like us to cover.
And there's a monthly newsletter.
All for just the price of a cup of coffee and a bit of cake every month.
And you get the deep appreciation from our team for your support.
Thank you very much.
Always bloody well getting the last word.
Always.